Okay, we are going to be taking a look at a build that a friend of mine on PC sent me. Uh, Goes by the name Anaray Senpai, and then I believe the build was derived from somebody called Esoteric. Uh, the main point of it is to be completely invisible all the time. I've been fussing around with it a little bit between some different gear pieces and all that kind of stuff. The main point is to use the top tree of Night Stalker and be invisible as much as possible. Now, you're not going to see a completely optimized version in my loadout because, well, fully upgrading and fully optimizing an entire build is fairly resource intensive in Destiny 2. But what I'm going to do is walk you through like a couple of different ways that this can be built, and we're going to be looking at the main exotic here, which is Frosties. So you sprint, it reduces your dodge cooldown as well as your other abilities, and when you dodge, it increases your sprinting speed. For the money number that you're looking for this build to work perfectly is 100 mobility, so that's just like the TLDR version of it. You're looking for 100 mobility, and this build doesn't have to be exactly the way that you see it displayed on the screen. I'm going to be using Bastion because I think Bastion is just a cool weapon, and if I'm doing casual running around stuff, there's no reason why I shouldn't be using it. I'm pairing with that Wendigo. Normally I use Delirium, but Wendigo seems to be fine, and it's going to fit with the rest of this build. And then to back it up, I'm going to be using Hush as my primary kinetic-based weapon. So that's the kind of kit. Bastion, it pierces through shields, has liquid coils, which increases its damage, and then shoots a slug. Its base damage is pretty decent, but if you can bolster its damage in any way, it has a pretty high DPS threshold. And Hush is kind of the same way. Its base damage is pretty good. Once you get its damage boosting perk, or once you get its perk going, not damage boosting, it feels really good. Now I use Anti-Barrier Ranger on my Hush instead of using the other one, which is Unstoppable. And the reason is because the Anti-Barrier doesn't come with an explosive payload. And sometimes the explosive payload can bypass Hush's ability. And the Anti-Barrier, I think, gives it shield piercing, which is in the description, but that also means that it technically gets armor piercing rounds. And armor piercing rounds are kind of the same thing as Wish Ender's perk. So when you're using anti-barrier ranger rounds or arrows, you basically have the same munitions as Wish Ender. So it's pretty cool. Really good. I highly recommend you try that. It's really efficient against the champions, and I really enjoy it. So yeah, we're really not going to be worried about anything from the seasonal artifact. That's how I have mine set up. It just kind of doesn't matter. I guess you could use like the Schwarzschild super condenser to use like stun from your melee on Unstoppables, but we're not going to worry about that. The main thing that we're going to do is kind of fuss around with the kind of ins and outs of this, and taking charge is one of the first pieces. So picking up an Orbalite charges you with the seasonal perk, which is charged with light, and that's going to enable the empowerment from the high energy fire, which is a 20% damage buff. So essentially the main point is just to get charged with light as much as possible so that your weapons do a lot of damage, and then your exotic is making it so that you're perpetually invisible all the time. Okay, and I am bright orange for a reason. I figure why not be a brightly colored hunter if I'm going to be invisible all the time anyways. So this is part of the original build, which I think was bypassed down through me. I've added the high energy fire because I require high DPS numbers in everything. I'm addicted to it. But the normal original build is mainly focused on just survivability. And so that's why you're going to see the protective light in here. And I decided that if I'm going to build this, I'm going to try and get as many perks out of this build as possible, as humanly possible. So what you're going to be looking here, you can see the green little line down there in the bottom corner. That's the strength thing. And you're going to note that if you use one of these charged with light perks, they tend to have a downside. And you'll see on the gear, there's not a huge recovery number here. This is something that I just want to talk about briefly. There's not a huge recovery number here, so it's like, well, why don't I use this perk here on this piece of gear, or you know, on a different one, or switch these perks around to try and maximize my benefit? Because here I'm using that negative recovery value on this piece of gear, and it's taking away 8 recovery versus something that's taking away 2, I think is how much I'm losing here. So why wouldn't I switch over the perk over to this armor piece and then change it there? But you'll note that it doesn't affect just the armor piece that you're taking it off of, it affects the cumulative total. So if you're using one of these perks, it doesn't matter if your gear piece has 10 or 20 or 30 or 0 recovery, it's still going to be taking that penalty for using that mod off of your gear anyways. So you're fine using these pieces wherever you can. It's going to be averaging your numbers out based on the cumulative score, and it will still count as a deficit to your gear score if you have that mod equipped, even if it's not being represented on your individual gear piece. Okay. So protective light is going to be in the arms. We're going to try and use the bow reloader. I think normally I'd just use the enhanced rifle reloader, and I think that you get more uptime with that. But I think we're going to be using the gambler's dodge with that. So dodge is going to be up all the time, and it doesn't really make sense to be manually reloading something when you have gambler's dodge anyways. Now here you're going to note that I have this helmet set up all ready to go into this build because I was testing this with 100 recovery and with 100 mobility and with the basic kind of stat split that I had previously shown on the screen. So Powerful Friends, this is a mod that's seasonal. You can get an additional plus 20 mobility. You'll see that my helmet has 40 mobility. It's a high mobility roll. So getting 40 mobility points out of any piece of gear is really good. And here I'm showing that you can get really high numbers in a wide variety of different things if you're using different armor pieces. And this is technically probably the most statistically good build. So Traction gives you an invisible plus 15 to your stat, and then we've got 100 recovery. That's as much mobility as you're ever really going to need. 100 recovery, but we're missing out on some of those seasonal artifact mods with the protective light, and we're also missing out on a seasonal artifact here or seasonal mod, which is stacks on stacks, which means every time you pick up an orb of light, you get 2 stacks instead of 1 stack. So I have often found the stacks on stacks perk to be extremely beneficial because that means that you can either get a kill or you sustain more damage when you have the Protected from the Void perk active. So stacks on stacks is a really good one to have because it's really easy to activate. You just pick up an orb and you get 2 stacks. And if you're using something like Izanagi's Burden, you're getting huge damage numbers on multiple targets instead of just one. So that's a good thing to consider if you're going to be making this build. But if you're not interested in taking that negative 10 to the recovery for that advantage, then that's something that you can stay away from too. So here I'm kind of stuck in a position where I can't use Traction. If I had Traction, then I could push the mobility of my current build or my current iteration of this build to a higher place, but I just opted to kind of use double Fusion Scavenger because it seemed to be fine. And I've only really tested this out in PvE. I don't know if I would use Bastion in PvP. It's not really a weapon that I really have a good feel for when it comes to PvP. And I probably wouldn't use Hush in PvP either, even though I know it's fairly good at it. It's still not something that I would use in PvP. But in PvE, Bastion's fine just because it's a casual experience, and this build is meant to kind of be casual too. But even though it's casual, it's still a ton of fun. So that's something to keep in mind, is that I've kind of built this to fit my needs, but I really like it, and I find it one of those builds that I gravitate to.